Good morning. Today I'm going to read the next installment of Julius Braunthal History of the International, 1864 to 1914. So yesterday I read the preface and the first two chapters, those covering the French Revolution and the role of Thomas Paine as an internationalist. And today I'm going to begin with chapter 3, and I might try to get at least part of the way into chapter 4, if not all the way through it. Chapter 4 is a little longer, so just begin and see how far we can get. Chapter 3 is titled The Corresponding Society. Out of the ferments which spread from France to the intellectuals and ordinary citizens of England, there sprang the first independent political working-class movement in history. Its founder was Thomas Hardy, 1752 to 1832, a Scottish shoemaker of strong character, thoughtful and well-read. In 1773, he had left his Scottish home in Stirlingshire for London, where he opened a small workshop in Piccadilly. In 1792, when he was 42 years old, he called a meeting in a public house with 8 of his friends and fellow artisans. He suggested to them that they establish a society to agitate for parliamentary representation. It was to be called the London Corresponding Society. Since national political organizations were prohibited, local societies would coordinate their activities through correspondence, in the form of letters, circulars, and delegate conferences. The membership fee was fixed at 1 penny, and all present immediately contributed. The society, therefore, started life with a capital of 9D. Pardon me not knowing old British currency abbreviations. Hardy remained its secretary until his arrest in 1794. Hardy's idea evoked an unexpectedly strong response among educated workers, artisans, and small shopkeepers. English branches were established in Sheffield, Coventry, Leeds, Nottingham, and Norwich, Scottish ones in Glasgow and Dundee. Soon after, branches appeared in the great industrial centres of Lancashire and Yorkshire. By the end of 1792, the societies had 20,000 members. In 1795, they had 80,000. In October 1795, an open-air demonstration attracted 150,000 people. Justifying the suspension of habeas corpus in May 1795, Pitt, the Prime Minister, told Parliament that the London Corresponding Society has reached the height of audacity. It is a Jacobin body and aims at destroying the rich. It was indeed Jacobin, and like the Jacobins of France, it hoped to replace oligarchy with a democratic form of society. The Corresponding Society did not aim at a social upheaval directed against property. Socialism was no part of its program. It fought for political equality and universal parliamentary suffrage. It wanted to end government by a rich minority, and transfer political power to the poor. It stood simply for democracy. But Pitt knew only too well that if democracy meant power in the hands of the poor, it would not be long before they used that power to threaten the property and privileges of the rich. The prevailing system of oligarchy did not only deny power to the mass of working people. The bulk of the middle class was equally excluded, and it supported the cause of parliamentary reform principally to transfer power to itself. Consequently, the corresponding society found itself linked with the liberal-minded section of the middle class in a common struggle for democracy. But above all, its members identified themselves with the French Revolution. Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man was printed by the corresponding society and distributed free, in great numbers, to working people. After the first victory of the French revolutionary armies in September 1792, the society sent a message of congratulation to the Assembly. It spoke of the hopes of working people, the fulfillment of which was to be expected by the victory of the French Revolution. Quote, "You are already free," it said, "and we now prepare ourselves for the victory of freedom in our country. Whilst you enjoy the enviable honor of being the pioneers of freedom, we, in our own minds, think of the blessings which are imminent for mankind. If you, as in our dearest wish, are finally victorious, there will then be a triple alliance, not of the crowns, but of the people. Americans, Frenchmen, and citizens of Great Britain will then bring freedom to the people of Europe and peace to the whole world." The Assembly replied with a spirited message of thanks. In Britain, members of the societies, after the fashion of the French Revolution, took to calling each other citizen instead of Mr., and referred to their conferences as conventions. And many societies also corresponded directly with the revolutionary clubs in France. The government was dismayed. As early as May 1792, a royal proclamation warned the country against such revolutionary writings as Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man. In December, the government reported to Parliament that British subjects were working together with foreigners to destroy the Constitution and overthrow the government. Vigorous countermeasures were threatened. 3 months later, war broke out between Britain and France. A war which Edmund Burke, in the House of Commons, demanded should become a crusade against the ideas of the French Revolution. The war should have as its aim the complete destruction of the frenzied hordes who were responsible for these ideas. The government intensified the persecution of the corresponding society, which Burke described as the mother of all evil. The authorities began to infiltrate the working class movement with spies and agents provocateurs in an attempt to bring its leaders to heel. The first victim was in Scotland. There the society was known as the Friends of the People. At a meeting of weavers, Thomas Muir, a young and talented pioneer of the movement, had demanded the right of the workers to be represented in Parliament. He was then charged with preparing for high treason and sentenced to 14 years' banishment in the penal settlement of Botany Bay. He managed to escape on a pirate ship which some American sympathizers had sent to rescue him. He was received with honor in France, but soon died from exhaustion, the effect of his imprisonment. The entire movement now decided to call a convention in Edinburgh, with representatives of all the branches in Britain, to protest against the savage sentence. At an open-air meeting in a working-class district of London, attended by 30,000 men and women, M. Margaret and J. Gerald were elected delegates of the London Corresponding Society. Okay, I frankified those names, but they're probably British. So, M. Margaret and J. Gerald, or Gerald, were elected delegates of the London Corresponding Society. I don't know why I'm having more trouble with my English pronunciation today, but... The convention met at the end of November. The government ordered it to dissolve. When it refused to do so, it was dispersed by armed force. A number of delegates were arrested, including Margaret and Gerald, after being found guilty of conspiring to overthrow the Constitution. All the accused were sentenced to 14 years in Botany Bay. Only one of them survived the fever and hardship. In both England and Scotland, and for a good many years, the workers kept alive their memory as honored martyrs. In 1843, a monument was erected to them in Edinburgh. The Corresponding Society refused to be intimidated. On the 20th of January, only a few weeks after the verdict, they issued a manifesto protesting against the imprisonment of their delegates, and also against the war. They called on all workers and citizens throughout the country to support them in their fight for freedom. "We must now choose," the manifesto declared, "between freedom and slavery. Shall we wait until barracks are built in every village, and the Hessians and Hanoverians are on our backs?" The manifesto made it clear that if foreign troops were brought into the country, habeas corpus repealed, martial law enforced, or the right of assembly destroyed, a convention would be called in London. This was a thinly disguised threat of revolution. At the same time, a large number of meetings were quickly called in London, and the provinces against the war. The conspiracy of kings against freedom. Pitt now decided to attack the leaders of the working class organizations. In the early hours of the 12th of May, 1794, Thomas Hardy and 11 other leading members of the society were arrested, taken to the Tower, and charged with high treason. They were accused of having maliciously and treacherously, alone and together with others, waged war against the king, a crime which, in the gruesome conditions of English law at the time, carried the most cruel death sentence. 4 days later, Pitt, on the authority of the king, asked the Commons to suspend habeas corpus until 1802, so that political suspects could be kept in custody without trial. The country, he declared, in justifying the emergency legislation, was in the grip of a dangerous conspiracy, whose aim it was to overthrow the Constitution and replace it with the rights of man. Government, law, property, and religion, so dear to the English people, were in danger of being swept away, as in France. Pitt accused the London Corresponding Society of being the most dangerous element in the conspiracy. Parliament endorsed Pitt's move, and habeas corpus was suspended. The working class leaders were brought before the Assizes on the 20th of October, 1794. The proceedings lasted for 5 days, but they did not go according to the government's wishes. The public prosecutor failed to prove that the accused had sworn to wage war against the king by force of arms. But he claimed to have proof that ideas of the kind propagated by the Corresponding Society had led in France to the overthrow of the monarchy and the execution of the king. As the Society had quite openly proclaimed its sympathy with the French Revolution and with Paine's The Rights of Man, he argued, it had declared by implication its intention to overthrow the monarchy in England, on the model of France. The proceedings were followed with intense emotion. London had been radical since the days of Cromwell, and a London jury was not to be intimidated. The courtroom was crowded every day, and in towns and villages, people gathered in the streets waiting for the stagecoach to bring news of the trial. On the 5th of November, the day of the verdict, a dense crowd filled the roads round the courthouse from early morning. When it was announced that the accused had been acquitted, the crowd broke into cries of joy and did not disperse until Thomas Hardy had been carried home in triumph. The government had not yet broken the back of the working class movement. The poverty resulting from the war had led to hunger riots. When George III drove to the House of Lords for the opening of Parliament in October 1795, the royal procession was greeted with hisses and wild shouts of "Down with the war! Down with Pitt!" On the king's return to St. James's St. James's Palace, soldiers of his bodyguard who were escorting the procession were pelted with stones and mud. In 1797, the disturbances reached a climax. The leaders of the United Irishmen had planned an invasion of Ireland with the help of the French government. A small detachment of French troops had actually landed. There was violent resistance to the new militia law in the eastern counties of Scotland. Still more serious was the naval mutiny provoked by the harsh conditions of life on board, which broke out at Spithead and spread as far as Duncan's squadron in Yarmouth. The mutineers blocked the mouth of the Thames and appealed to the people for support. The uprising was finally crushed. In effect, nearly all traces of freedom in Britain had now been wiped out. Soon after the public demonstrations against the king, a new and stronger law against high treason was passed, together with another law forbidding meetings not authorized by the authorities. No further meetings, in fact, took place. In 1798, the government ordered the arrest of the entire executive committee of the London Corresponding Society and held them in prison for 3 years without trial. A law passed in 1799 a law passed in 1799 prohibited debating societies and forbade political speeches to make contact with each other. Forbade political societies to make contact with each other, either verbally or in writing. Finally, in 1800 and 1801, the workers were denied the right of trade union organization. The law remained in force until 1825. The first political working class association in history was destroyed by force. The industrial proletariat was still in process of development into a modern, self-confident working class. It was not yet mature enough, either morally or intellectually, to defy the supreme power of the state or bring off a successful revolution. Moreover, the peasants had been effectively crushed for some time by a series of enclosure acts. And the liberal-minded middle class, who had greeted the French Revolution with such joy and sympathized with the corresponding society, were by no means revolutionary. Their aims were limited to political reform. Also, among the intellectuals, many of the earliest friends of democracy, such as Coleridge, Southey, and Wordsworth, were disillusioned with the French Revolution when, at home, internecine struggles became continually more grim, while abroad, what had begun as a war of liberation against despotism degenerated into a war of conquest. Such men became terrified of the revolution. Francis Place, a faithful friend of Hardy, who later continued his work, testified of the repressive laws, that, infamous as these laws were, they were popular measures. As the main conditions for revolution were absent, the fate of the first attempt at a working-class political society was sealed. Its story forms, nevertheless, an important chapter in the history of both the English labor movement and the international, because it was infused with the conviction that the fate of the working people of all countries was linked together in a common destiny. In this way, it established the tradition of international solidarity in the English labor movement. Thus the corresponding society. So, this next chapter, chapter 4, let's see how long we have here. It's a little longer. It is broken up into sections. Let's see, I think there's 3 sections here. 4 sections. So perhaps I'll try to cover the first 2 sections. I will unfortunately probably have to leave off for the morning. I might come back tomorrow morning. I don't think Sundays get as many views, but we'll see. Chapter 4. The Conspiracy of the Equals. Section 1. The French Revolution of 1789, beginning of a social ferment which spread over half of Europe, started as a revolt of the wealthier section of the middle class against absolutism. Nothing was further from their thoughts than the overthrow of the monarchy. They intended only to establish a constitutional monarchy on the English model, with a sharing of power between king and parliament. Their ultimate object, if only vaguely conceived, was the transformation of the existing aristocratic system into a middle-class capitalist society. The absolute monarchy of Louis XVI was justified in terms of divine right, which was based in its turn on a transcendental, mystical interpretation of the Bible. According to this doctrine, all authority is divine in origin, and therefore eternal and irrevocable, unaffected either by human rights or human desires. The theory was revived in the Middle Ages in the course of the struggle between Pope and Emperor as to which divine right, the spiritual or the temporal, had precedence over the other. However, the idea of the divine right of kings was not as such brought into question during the course of the dispute. It was accepted as dogma by the great mass of people, and was not questioned even by scholars until the middle of the 17th century. The French bourgeoisie, in its struggle to curb the absolute power of the king, to challenge the theory of divine right, and to divide power between king and people, required a legal doctrine. In the theory of the social contract, they found a rational basis for opposing the absolutist doctrine of divine right. Justification for this new view was found in the Old Testament, which said that King David made a treaty with his people, and that his power had accordingly been based, as it were, on a social contract. The Middle Ages was a deeply religious period, in which every word of both Old and New Testaments was taken to be divinely inspired. It was the lack of the theologians, it was the task of the theologians to reconcile these two conflicting doctrines. This was undertaken by Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 74. In his treatise De Regimine Principium, pardon my Latin pronunciation, De Regimine Principium, he distinguished three elements in secular power: its essential substance, bestowed by God; its constitutional form, which could be monarchical, aristocratic, or democratic; and the form in which the ruling power was exercised, the latter two being bestowed on government by the people. It followed that if a government misused the power entrusted to it by the people, and degenerated into a form of slavery, the people were entitled to revoke the power they had granted. This doctrine contained the nucleus of both the social contract and the sovereignty of the people. It was the prevailing view in the Middle Ages among both theologians and lawyers. Philosophers in 17th century England and 18th century France combined these theological teachings with the theories of natural law, also derived from the thinking of the ancient world. According to this view, people are free and equal in natural law, and actually enjoyed freedom and equality while living in natural conditions. When, however, they began to establish a social order, they installed a government and made a treaty by which they assigned to it their sovereignty in return for undertaking to protect their rights and freedoms. From this premise, one school of thought concluded that the social contract was indissoluble and irrevocable, and therefore that sovereignty and royal power were absolute and indivisible. Another school came to the opposite conclusion, that since the sovereignty of the people was inalienable and irrevocable, the people retained the right to alter the contract with the king, or to revoke it and take back the power vested in him. Since the people were the source of all power, the sovereignty enjoyed by the king was delegated to him only by the people. The execution of Charles I in 1649 and the deposition of James II in 1688 brought to an end in England the controversy about divine right and popular sovereignty. The people, represented by Parliament, took back power into their own hands and beheaded Charles I for resisting by force the sovereignty of the people. They dethroned James II for abusing the power with which he had been entrusted by the people. And so, as the Convention of 1688 stated in its proclamation, of having endeavored to subvert the constitution of the kingdom by breaking the original contract between king and people. The theoretical justification for this act of popular sovereignty was provided by John Locke in 1690. His work on civil government was epoch-making. Based on the theory of natural law, Locke's clear and logical demonstration that power in state and society resided in the people contributed powerfully to the American Revolution of 1776 and the French Revolution of 1789. In France, the theory of popular sovereignty found its classical expression in Rousseau's Du Contrat Social, which appeared in 1762. Contemporary religious and metaphysical views of regal harmony as the embodiment of divine grace had already been destroyed, at a philosophical level, by such writers as Helvetius, Holbach, and Diderot and Voltaire. But Rousseau's idea that since the sovereignty of the people derived from men's natural rights, every individual in consequence participated in sovereignty through his own natural right, was circulated far and wide in thousands of vehement pamphlets, reaching far beyond a limited circle of intellectuals to the broad mass of the people. It became a popular myth, a source of political enthusiasm, a symbol of salvation. When Louis XVI summoned the States General in May 1789 and instructed the electors of the Third Estate, the tax-paying male population, to submit a list of their grievances and demands, it was the spirit of Rousseau which permeated the Cahiers. They demanded equality of rights, equal justice, free speech, the abolition of feudal dues, and above all, a responsible executive and an elected assembly. Inspired by such ideas, the majority of the electorate called for a solemn declaration of the natural, inalienable, and sacred rights of man. Since, as was subsequently stated when the Constitution of 1791 drew up its preamble to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, the ignorance, neglect, or disregard of the rights of man is the sole source of public misfortune and the corruption of governments. Section 2. But how were the natural, inalienable, and sacred rights of man, proclaimed by the French National Assembly in August 1789, to be reconciled with the economic and social requirements of a middle-class capitalist society? The Declaration opened boldly with the statement, "Men are born and remain free and equal." But the recognition of freedom and equality as the basic natural rights of men was not necessarily compatible with a society based on economic and social inequality, a society in which the propertied and propertyless classes were sharply divided. The National Assembly at first tried to solve this conflict of principles and class interests by dividing the people into active and passive citizens, into taxpayers, the true shareholders in the great social enterprise, according to the constitution drafted by Sieyès, and those whose incomes were too low to be taxed. There's a note here. The debates in the French National Assembly in 1791 on the right of the poor to vote had their precedence in the famous Putney debates of 1647. There, the delegates of Cromwell's Revolutionary Army, both privates and officers, had met to discuss the agreement of the people, which was to lay the foundation for popular rights. The representatives of the units demanded as an absolute natural right an equal vote for all subjects. General Ireton denied the existence of any such absolute natural right. People who had nothing to lose had no right to elect the lawmakers. Mr. Rich, another representative of the propertied classes, argued that those without property would naturally elect non-propertied people to represent them. It could then happen, he went on, that the majority would abolish property and decree equal possessions for all. In fact, more than 2,000 years ago, the concept of demokratia, literally the rule of the people, was interpreted by the political theorists of democracy's birthplace, Plato and Aristotle, as government by the poor. Back to the main text. The latter, the people whose incomes were too low to be taxed, were deprived, on Sieyès' proposal, of the right to participate actively in public life. They were denied the right to vote. Even the active citizens were divided into two electoral groups, so as to guarantee the predominance of the larger shareholders. Finally, the right to be elected was restricted to such a high income level that Camille Desmoulins pointed out in the debate on the electoral laws, Rousseau, Corneille, and Mably, among others, would not have been eligible for election. In this way, the propertied middle class secured an electoral system which guaranteed it political power. It could now establish itself as a new privileged class. Eventually, it secured for itself complete control over the state. As Aulard remarked, they acted on the not very fraternal view that the middle class alone constitutes the nation. The aristocracy of birth gave way to an aristocracy of money. The middle class used its power chiefly to establish security for private property. The Declaration of the Rights of Man had already proclaimed this to be a natural and immutable right, inviolable and sacred. When hunger provoked popular uprisings, this right seemed to be threatened. Danton demanded in the convention that all personal property in land and industry should be, for all time, protected by the nations. The convention accordingly, on the 18th of May, 1793, passed a unanimous decree that made even propaganda against the existing property laws punishable by death. This was applied to anyone who proposes agrarian or other subversive legislation concerning landed, commercial, or industrial property. Even earlier, the convention had issued a decree on the 14th of June, 1793, dissolving all trade unions and journeymen's associations as a threat to freedom and incompatible with the Declaration of the Rights of Man, forbidding them to be reconstituted under threat of punishment, while at the same time instructing the authorities to suppress by force all associations of artisans, laborers, and journeymen formed for the purpose of bargaining on wage questions. Isaac Isaac Le Chapelier, supporting this in the convention, did not deny that the low level of wages made for a condition of dependence little better than slavery. But property had to be protected against the threat of an organized proletariat. Indeed, it is fair to say that perhaps nowhere, at no time, and in no country, has the right of private property been more firmly claimed and more firmly guaranteed than by the French Revolution. Workers employed in factories and small workshops looked to the Revolution for an improvement in their conditions. They hoped for better pay, the legal control of food prices, and an easing in their constant struggle for economic independence. As artisans and journeymen who hoped one day to set up as masters on their own on a small scale, they had no intention of questioning the institution of private property. All they sought was security for the small property owner. They were against the large estates. They wanted a maximum size of property to be laid down for private ownership, so that one and the same citizen may possess only one shop and one workshop, and that no one may hold more land in tenure than is required for a stipulated number of plows. But such strivings were irreconcilably opposed to the built-in drive of a capitalist economy toward the concentrated ownership of capital and industry. In the period of the French Revolution, the workers did not yet constitute a class. Whereas the middle class had their own political organization in the Jacobin clubs, there was no independent party to represent the workers. Though they provided the vanguard in all the popular uprisings, they were content to follow the intellectual leadership of the middle class. The frequently occurring strike movements were only undercurrents in the social development of the revolution. Indeed, the workers did not produce a single important figure in the course of the revolutionary struggles. Even at the height of the ferment, in 1793 and 1794, members of the petite bourgeoisie, journalists, lawyers, priests, and tradesmen functioned as spokesmen for the proletariat. Such men inevitably reflected the outlook and interests of the middle rather than the working class. Workers and other humble folk, the sans-culottes, had defended the revolution with their blood. It was they who stormed the Bastille and they who at Marsfeld engaged the royal forces whom the court had ordered on the 14th of July, 1789, to suppress the revolution. They had fought for the revolution on numerous battlefields. And all the time, they saw the rich grow richer, their wealth swollen by the sale of the lands which the state had confiscated from the nobility and the church, their pockets lined with the proceeds of army contracts, financial speculation, and juggling with food supplies. Meanwhile, the poor grew poorer. The peasants at least had been freed from their feudal overlords and become owners of the land they tilled. But the workers had gained nothing. The rights of man and the gospel of liberty, equality, and fraternity had left them destitute. The disinherited were well aware of the marked contrast between the principles of the revolution and those of a social order based on middle-class property. As Jacques Roux complained to the convention, liberty is only an empty illusion if one class of people can with impunity starve another. Equality is only an empty illusion while the rich retain their monopoly, which gives them power of life and death over their fellow creatures. This precisely expressed the feelings of the wage earners, artisans, and urban poor. Their revolt brought Marat and Robespierre to power. Some decades earlier, Morelly and Mably, in their philosophical writings, had projected a utopian version of socialism. But to Jacques Roux, on the extreme left of the convention, and to the Jacobin leaders, Marat and Robespierre, this did not seem a realistic solution to the conflict. They were merely against the abuses of wealth. They believed in a maximum size for property holdings. They wanted to lessen the contrasts between rich and poor. Their ideal was that portrayed by Rousseau in his Du Contrat Social, in which all have something and none too much. They hoped to create a republic of small farmers and handicraftsmen. They did not consider the destruction of the existing basis of property, the replacement of private by common ownership, to be a matter for serious consideration. The struggle to solve the insoluble conflict between the rights of man, based on a concept of natural freedom and equality, and the interests of middle-class property owners, determined the internal development of the revolution from its inception. It fought out in the convention between the Gironde, the party of the propertied middle class and the substantial citizens, and the Jacobins, who presented the petty bourgeoisie, artisans, who represented the petty bourgeoisie, artisans, wage earners, and peasants. In May 1793, the Gironde was overthrown. The Jacobins became heirs to the revolution, but it was an inheritance fraught with danger. France was at war, surrounded by powerful enemies who had invaded her from north and east. At the same time, in the west and south, in the Vendée, Lyon, Marseille, Bordeaux, and Toulon, an armed counter-revolution had broken out against Paris. A rapid currency depreciation had forced food prices to fantastic heights. It seemed as though the revolution would succumb to its enemies at home and abroad. To avert the danger, the Jacobins established a revolutionary dictatorship and a reign of terror. With their arrival in power, there began a second revolution, a revolution of the broad urban masses. But this revolution, too, was doomed to fail, since it could not aim at the destruction of the capitalist order. What distinguished the second revolution from the first was only its more pronounced democratic tendency and more advanced social aims. It abolished the tax qualification for the right to vote. It proclaimed in the Constitution of 1793 that the aim of society was the general welfare. Apart from that, however, property was still listed in the Constitution as one of the natural and inalienable rights, with every citizen having the right to enjoy his property and his earnings, and to dispose of them at his own discretion. Since encroachments on private property, as were made by the Committee of Public Safety, the organ of the revolutionary dictatorship, were war measures taken to deal with a national emergency. Such encroachments, let me reread that. Such encroachments on private property, as were made by the Committee of Public Safety, the organ of the revolutionary dictatorship, were war measures taken to deal with a national emergency. The committee issued decrees to prohibit speculation in foodstuffs and other vital necessities. It controlled the price of food, but at the same time put a ceiling on wages. While it confiscated the property of enemies of the Republic and allocated the proceeds for the relief of destitution, it also made it clear that the property of patriots is sacred and inviolable. Note, as to the confiscation of property of the rich, Lichtenberger observes, the property of the rich is not attacked because it is unjust in itself, but because the owners are counter-revolutionary. The poor are benefited not only because they have a right to subsistence, but because they are patriots. Very important. Back to the text. To the cry of "Down with the tyrant Robespierre! Freedom!" the wealthier section of the middle class brought about the downfall of the Jacobin dictatorship and its reign of terror on the 9th of Thermidor, or the 27th of July, 1794. But in fact this marked the beginning of the period of the demolition of freedom, as F.A. Mignet, a historian of the French Revolution, called it. The general franchise was abolished and replaced by the two-tier electoral law. The press was once more in shackles, and finally, by the end of the consulate, its freedom was completely destroyed. One after another, the clubs were closed down, and every movement of the lower middle class and of the workers was crushed by a regime of terror. The Revolutionary Wars of 1792, 1793, and 1794, which had been conducted as a struggle for liberating enslaved peoples, degenerated into imperialist wars of conquest. And after a few weeks, a few weeks after the 18th of Brumaire, or the 9th of November, 1799, the Constitution of 1799 placed the entire power of government in the hands of the first consul, Napoleon Bonaparte. William Hazlitt had cause to complain that the sun of freedom was swallowed up by the night of despotism. With the fall of the Jacobins, the revolution was left drained of its power. Tired of the struggle, the workers subsided into apathy. Disillusioned by the revolution, they surrendered in defeat. I'm going to leave off there for today, but there's still half of that chapter left. It doesn't end on such a gloomy note, although there are many gloomy notes throughout the story, so must remain steeled. Okay, have a good day.